So in this episode, we talk about what you can do to awaken or activate your higher chakras so you can break those bonds of materialism and hear once more your intuition, the voice of your own higher self. Hello and welcome back to the Spiritual Freedom Show. My name is Darren Ball, and this is the podcast helping you to awaken your chakras, to unlock your psychic powers, and to discover true spirituality. So in this episode, you'll discover why and how materialism has been designed to keep you disconnected from your own spiritual power, to sabotage your spiritual evolution. You'll learn about simple yet powerful practices that you can use to activate your heart chakra and begin to hear your intuition. You also find out how to transmute that basic intellectual capability that we all have into deep wisdom and inner clarity, so you can create better karma and soar towards enlightenment. Now, if you haven't subscribed yet, do hit that bell so you don't miss any future conversations between Richard and myself covering this awesome information about chakras that you will not hear anywhere else.
Richard.
Darren.
So I'm excited to do this show today because there seems to be a lot of misconceptions when I look online and talk to people about the fact that there are some chakras that are good and some chakras that are bad. I think it creates a lot of problems with suppression, maybe repression even, and even wrong ideas about the role of things like material things.
Right.
Like that. And so we talked about previously on the show about the reality that there's no good and bad chakras per se, but that really it's about either misuse or overuse or underuse of certain chakras in our lives and the results that causes us. So what I wanted to focus on was which chakras do we tend to misuse or underuse versus those that we overuse? What might we do to rectify that as well?
I would actually say they're all good. I'd go that far.
Okay. Yeah.
Potentially, but they can be misused, overused, underused.
Okay.
I would say underuse of the higher chakras is one of our biggest problems.
Yes.
Imbalanced use of a chakra. We've mentioned before the partial activation of one face of the heart center leading to emotional sentiment and so forth excessively. And I'd like to say this too, one doesn't have to sort of study the chakras to know, to use them.
Yes, totally.
They are being used anyway. If you are aware of them and you, in the right way, and I have to stress that in the right way, then of course you have an added advantage in the whole of your life. But broadly speaking, there are multiple people who've never heard of Kundalini, never heard of chakras, who are drawing on both those things all the time.
Totally. Yeah, I think you've given some great examples in the past of people who have had profound Kundalini and mystical experiences, but who have never heard of Kundalini before, no doubt.
Hildegard of Bingen, Wordsworth, several others. Yeah.
So, I mean, in general, so you've given us a good outline there, I think, underuse of the higher and overuse of the lower chakras. I mean, what does that really mean in terms of like what's happening in our life? I mean, we talk about the overuse of our lower chakras. What's going on? Why does that tend to happen?
Well, there's the overuse and there's the incorrect use.
Okay.
So what often happens from a technical point of view, as explained mainly by Dr. King, actually, but you can find it elsewhere too, is that the Kundalini is raised up the front of the body certainly to the sex center and the solar plexus center even.
Okay.
To some degree. It's not an entirety, I'm sure, but to some degree. And this can cause an increased activation of those chakras. What I would say is, and actually there's a brilliant analysis of this by the master Aetherius in a transmission he delivered called From Free Will to Freedom. And he gives a short sort of peroration, I think is the wrong word, because I think that comes at the end, but it's not at the end, but little passage about this. And it really describes the condition of humanity. And essentially what happens is that the intellect, as he describes it, this is my words, not his, is used, and education is even used to keep in being a materialistic scheme which is basically there for our personal pleasures and delights. I think he calls it our basic delights of all kinds, not just sex, but multiple forms of indulgence. And this is a result of the activation of the lower centers Now, all this is rectified by a number of things. I mean, there are various practices. Now, the practices given by the master Aetherius, many of them, it's amazing how many of them, and this is what really, really inspired me to put on these events I'm now putting on, are tied into chakras. In fact, it's amazing how many practices are tied into chakras, but we didn't realize, or tied into kundalini, or the flow of energy through nadis and channels within us. Now, where people go wrong in terms of teaching about this very often is they know a little bit. They believe that the colours are what they're taught. The colours may not quite be what they taught. We've covered that before. And then they try and come up with something to activate a chakra with those colours using your visualization, which may be the very worst thing you could possibly do for your own overall balance. So how do you rectify it? You rectify it by, first of all, correct personal conduct is a basic start. When that starts to happen, you start to become more stable. When you're becoming more stable, you are drawing the energies to the base of the spine so that they can be risen upwards. When one's getting into kundalini exercises and so forth, or visualizations, let me say, and practices, there's often a focus on raising energies upwards, but you also need to bring certain energies, and I mentioned energies that have gone up the front of this body, down again.
So they can
come up. There's a very mystical exercise given by the Master Chang Fu about that, actually. He gave it to Dr. King personally. But you have to, yes, bring the energies down, bring them in balance, correct stability, starting with the base center and working through the various centers. And it's not easy. Not easy to keep it under control. But your absolute key is service. Service, when you are serving others, providing you're in a position to do so, I should say that, you know, in other words, there are things that have to be attended to in life, unfortunately, and, you know, such as paying the bills and etc. But providing you're in a position to do so, when you are giving great service, you are immediately activating higher centers. You are in tune with the function of your higher centers. You know, a moment came, and I've quoted this before, so forgive me, but I think it bears repeating for those who've heard it before. For Dr. King, he was then, what would he be, 20, I think he'd be, years old.
1939.
Yes, and a moment came when he had to decide whether to sign up to join the army and fight the war and so on. In his family, there was a tradition of being pacifistic. His father had been in the medical corps, actually, in the First World War.
Didn't know.
Yeah. So it was like a Quaker tradition that he'd had. But he had to make the decision. And he described, now he was a person who was excelled in martial sports, boxing, shooting, and loved them. Quartermastering, an old form of English fighting. And so his actually, it was the opposite to a lot of people. He actually wanted to go. He found it exciting. It was, something he would have liked to do. But he says that a part of him said, and it would be a higher part of him, thou shalt not kill. And therefore, these are the words he used. He says, I let that part win. And he became a conscientious objector, a very active one, mind you, fighting in the Blitz, not fighting, but helping in the fire service, dangerous, etc. Did all that. But for him, and you can't be dogmatic about what everybody else should do, but for him, that would have been the wrong, given who he was and what he was going to do with his life. Far too dangerous, apart from anything else, to put that at risk. And he made the right decision. But the point I'm coming to is he let that part win. Yeah. And that's the thing, one often gets a higher prompting. One knows it, one recognizes it. One could argue oneself all around morality, ethics, and find a rationale for all kinds of things. But in the end, there's that inner voice. Now, that's coming from a higher chakra. And I would suggest particularly the heart center. There's this big moment when you start to activate the heart center. And that's why in the Etheric Society, we very, very much focus on the heart center. For a start, it's one center you can visualize and safely, as long as it's done in the right way. It's not the physical position, actually, because the heart's on the left side. It's in the center. It's in front of the physical body. But the flow of energy through that, every time you pray the way we pray, will activate that chakra. And then will bring you closer, even though that's not your motive, to your own higher self, your own higher intuition, what you might call your soul. That's where you really start to move in the direction of your soul. When you bridge that gap between the solar plexus and the heart center, and your understanding, your mentality, your basic logic, if you like, is governed by a higher consciousness.
I mean, actually, when you put it like that, I'm just reflecting here. It's amazing how brilliant and simple it is.
Very simple.
That we have all these problems that are caused, by the conditioning and whatnot that we find ourselves in the world. The education, the intellectualism, the materialism. But if we just start to practice, as you're describing, using our heart center, expressing this love, we kind of overcome all of those things by drawing the energy up in a correct way.
Yeah.
Under the inspiration and influence of our own higher chakras that we're beginning to let win, as you kind of put those words.
Yeah.
And that's something that anyone can do. It's not like...
I think dynamic prayer is one of the very, very best ways to activate your higher chakras. It's a simple practice. You do it to help others. You do it to serve others, which makes it all the better, much better for that. But at the same time, you're bringing energy down. So you're activating the heart chakra the way we pray, which I think is miles ahead, to be honest, of the way some other religions and believers pray. Not denigrating them, but it's just a more advanced methodology by far. Just that one thing alone, sending energy out. It goes through the palms of the hands as well, of course, but through the heart center, activates it. Something else happens as well. When you focus on a chakra, you draw energy to it. So the energy from lower than the heart, even though that's not your primary focus, must be drawn upwards as well, because that's where you're placing your consciousness. If you're able to place your consciousness, if a person is able to, in the Christ center, they will know why. Now, if you're a great master, you can do that at will. You can be conscious and then for a moment activate that chakra if you're that advanced, and you get the knowledge, the wisdom you need immediately and act on it. So these higher centers are where you're starting to gain that soul connection.
I think it's a very relevant point to a lot of seekers, because almost always, at an event or something that we have, I hear people ask about, how can I begin to listen to my intuition, or begin to hear my intuition, or, start to follow the guidance that, my inner voice within me. And it all kind of goes back to what you're saying.
Yeah. Well, there's basic intuition, and what some people call basic intuition anyway, or they call it intuition, and there's higher intuition. So there are different levels of intuition, and eventually you go to the highest level, where you are. I mean, where it should really be coming from is your higher self. It should be coming from your divine self. If we were advanced enough, it would be virtually the voice of God within us all. But it's being translated through mind. Soul is a superconscious mind. It's still mind, though, the soul. The spirit, the divinity within, is above that. Psychic powers, which I know quite a bit about, those are the ability in one way or another to tune in through the various senses generally, or feelings, to other forces. But they don't tell you why. You could get a very strong premonition and not know what it means.
I see. No context.
Or why, you need the intuition to guide you to use even your psychic powers. So in that extent, intuition, in fact, psychic powers aren't necessarily good. It depends how they're used. They are natural.
Yes. Okay. Gotcha.
And we should develop them in one way or another. We should unlock them. We should release them. Otherwise, they are blockages, but in different ways and to different degrees and for different reasons, depending on the person. They might even call themselves psychic, but they may well be psychic. They may be able to pick up what people think, what people feel, and help them perhaps in their work in some way. They don't say I'm psychic, but actually they're using a psychic power. Yeah. But in the end, though, to really know what these things mean and how we should direct our lives, we have to contact the intuition. And you start to do that, I believe, when you go towards the heart center and higher.
I think another great reason to be cultivating that center.
Yeah.
The dynamic prayer, a great example, healing another example, but all these opportunities to draw the energy upwards, be radiating it outwards, and be starting to live our lives under the guidance of our own higher selves. There's another great, I think, connection that you've made there, which is, we've spoken on the show previously about, the great conspiracy on earth, the materialistic conspiracy. Yeah. And it just struck me when you were talking there about the chakras that there's a huge element of this, which is in sort of encouraging the misuse or the overuse of the lower chakras to almost like sabotage ourselves in terms of our spiritual advancement. And in that way, it's quite terrifying. Because if you wanted to be extremely wealthy, which a lot of people do want to be, they don't realize, of course, that wealth doesn't necessarily equal happiness. It certainly doesn't necessarily represent peace. Might represent stimulating activity, but not true inner peace. However, if you do, the cleverer you are, the more you might make money, frankly. And so the education system is geared to making people clever. And truth goes by the board. I mean, we know it goes by the board in politics. It can go by the board in law, because the lawyer is representing their client, whether it's true or whether it isn't true. It can go by the law, by the wayside, in business, in many occupations. And if that's your sole goal, is to become as wealthy as possible, then you are activating. You're motivated by lower centers, by greed, probably by the desires, which might come from maybe the sex center activated in the wrong way. And I don't just mean lust there, by the way. I mean, desires for all kinds of indulgence and appetites in general. But you are educating yourself, and that would be primarily developing the solar plexus center, but for the wrong reason. Now, if it's for the right reason, it's absolutely wonderful. If it's guided by, higher knowledge, and then it applies itself as to how can I accomplish this? I mean, to perform a great act of service, you might need to be very clever. You might need to be very subtle. You might need to take into account and be very cognizant of the way of the world. So it's not that those things are necessarily wrong or useless. It's what is guiding them and what is your purpose. It's really helpful, actually, because it gives a lot of understanding of the world around us and why it's the way it is, and why there are certain forces that would want to keep it that way.
Of course.
Who would want to, maintain conditions that distance us from our own higher self and the inspiration of that higher self in our lives. And would want us to kind of overindulge these appetites and whatnot to overactivate these lower chakras and keep us in sort of this suppressed state of non-inspiration, out of touch with our own soul.
And there's another thing that can come into play, which is an even more deadly drug, actually, than the appetites, the physical appetites, and that is the lust for power. And that's a subtle one, and that can come certainly with the wrong activation of the solar plexus center, for one thing. It's a powerful center. It won't be, it could be more complex than that. I'm not limiting it to that, but it's something that, it can be quite voracious, and people can, just no longer be satisfied by their wealth, and they want a slice of power, but not for the right reason. Power, you see, here's the thing. Ambition isn't a bad thing. In the book Light on the Path, which is an old theosophical book, brilliant book, actually, it says, kill out ambition. Ambition, actually, that's wrong. I know what it means, We know where it's coming from. But really, ambition of itself isn't necessarily bad. Ambition might be very, very good, providing it's an ambition to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
And you might need to push, a person might need to push their ego, even, in order to put themselves in the right position to give great service. Providing that's the governing motive and they don't get lost somewhere down the line and lose out why they're doing it.
Yeah, it's very clear.
And it becomes an ego trip.
That's really clear.
Rather than the service. It might be good. It all depends. And that all comes down to being governed by the higher chakras, governed by the intuition, the guiding light, which comes from above.
Yeah, it reminds me of that king and servant analogy that's often given in spiritual teaching, in which you might equate the higher self, the king with the higher self, and the servant with the lower self, and they talk about a situation in which the servant they deposed the king and is now in control of the court and sort of running rampant, but also subject to the jealousies, the hatreds, all the weaknesses of our that we find in our lower selves, and it's interesting that. That's actually the situation, not only that we find ourselves in, a lot of people find themselves personally in life, but also even in our governing systems in the world. It seems that a lot of times we're not being governed by wisdom per se, but of these lower aspects. Yeah,
indeed. And what I would say too, if you were fulfilling an ambition and you were asserting yourself, not only would your motive have to be right, it would have to be what you're meant to be doing, and it would have to be true. And you would have to maintain humility within yourself, or you would fall. And
buying into the delusion of it.
Yeah, well, for example, I always come back to this, so forgive me, but Mozart.
Yeah.
He knew he was the greatest musician at that time, certainly in Vienna, I would say possibly in the world on the physical plane at that time. He said so. He didn't hold back and he pushed himself, and maybe he needed to, in order to establish what his work was. Now, you could be a person who was the greatest musician on earth at that time and still be very humble, because you could be very aware of your many faults. I'm not picking him out here, but I think he had some, what we can gather. You could be aware of your many faults. You could be aware of let me give actually another example. You could be more advanced spiritually than some other people that you know. And you might know that you are spiritually more advanced than them in certain regards. You could also see in them qualities from which you could learn, and you could see failings. And you could also see that much as you might be in a certain circle, a leading figure, in the scheme of evolution, you're tiny. You're nothing. And next to a Jesus, next to a Buddha, next to a Dr. George King, next to a Sri Krishna, you are pitiful. So you can very easily maintain humility.
Yeah, I see your point.
You see what I mean?
Yeah.
But if you get lost, as they say, you believe your own PR or whatever.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Yeah, then you're in trouble.
Yeah,
definitely in trouble.
Well, a lot of these things that you're describing seem like, it's the right mode and putting things in their right place in the service of something greater.
Yeah.
And like material things, you can put that in the service of something greater. I mean, even what you're describing now is in the service of something greater. And it's sort of having the clarity to know, what the truth is and why you're doing it.
Yeah, and perhaps a bigger test for some might be to see that actually you aren't the best solution to this, and that actually you should be deferring to somebody else because they've got abilities you haven't got. And you might not even like them, but for the greater good, you will defer to them in that regard. And, some of the adepts, the great adepts, the way they work together is absolutely beautiful. Because they know each other's abilities, and they'll know, well, this one, if we really want a judgment made about this kind of thing, he or she is the one to go to on that. But if, on the other hand, we want to be dealing with certain types of visualization or perhaps certain types of healing then we need to go to this one or to that one. And they will work together in that way.
Yeah, there's a beautiful harmony with that complete sort of recognition and acknowledgement of the different strengths that they bring to the table.
Yeah.
So I think there's a really powerful message today. I feel in terms of why we're in the state that we're in generally on Earth. That how that ties into the chakras and the overuse of the lower chakras. How we can rectify, how we all can rectify that through even simple practices like the dynamic prayer that help us to activate our higher chakras, and the big step up that we take between the solar plexus and the heart.
It's a big step up. And they call it a granthi in their writings, as these actual, they call them knots, crossing over of, they say, the two forces called Ida and Pingala, each side of the central channel, Susumna. Myself, I think it's probably more complex than that. That's a simplified explanation of it. But in the end, though, it's some kind of blockage which we have to get through. And it's a big one, and it's a big step. And it moves us to another level. But it doesn't mean we leave the use of the lower centers. They're still there, and they're still essential.
I can't remember it exactly now, but in one of the lectures by Dr. King, he was talking about this step as you've described it. And I felt a great sense of relief when I was reading it, because it just seemed to me to be the answer to so many of our problems that we have on Earth. Because he was talking about, when you move into the heart center, you sort of transmute that what can go wrong there, which is that lust for power and the greed and all that. And I thought, wow, that's a real insight into the nature of humanity and our sort of like the personality of humanity as a whole, and how it arises out of the use of a certain chakras and the misuse or underuse of other ones.
Well, I think we can be very bothered by some of the lower centers. They can cause us to be bothered needlessly by things. And when we start to enter the higher, let's say the heart center, a great sense of peace can come over us. And suddenly the things we don't, didn't matter anyway. And I didn't need this, and I didn't need that. Another final thing I will say, and we're told this actually by Mars Sector 6 in the Second Freedom, that if we radiate love in our waking state, we'll radiate it in our sleep state. Now, that's an activation of higher chakras, love.
Yeah.
And so you can take that as almost like a clue for other things too. If we start to become at peace, if we start to enter these states, then the lower center activation will not bother us so much in our sleep state. So just one benefit can be you sleep far more peacefully, just apart from anything else. Now, it won't happen immediately, because particularly if there have been blockages, those things might become very active in your sleep state, and you might have very disturbed state as you're starting to make the transition, but you'll reach a point where it will be continuous, because where you put your consciousness affects how you are all the time. And it's habitual. And we get into habits, or samskaras, as they used to call them. And so we take our consciousness, if we get into the habit of taking our consciousness higher, say through dynamic prayer, that will just continue. It will continue on, and it will start to alter the flow of prana by day and by night.
That's brilliant. There's a massive secret to life.
Massive secret.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Here's a few takeaways that I'd like to offer you from the show. The first is that looking at the materialistic conspiracy through the lens of the chakras was personally hugely eye-opening for me. It's so obvious in hindsight now why the conspiracy was designed the way that it is, but also why we're so lost, because we've lost touch with the voice of our own soul. Just consider how much it would change the world if, instead of greed, a hunger for material wealth, this lust for power, this preoccupation with sex, etc., if instead of that, we were devoted to helping others as an expression of this true, unconditional, impersonal love that we can feel when we begin to realize our oneness with all things in creation. And that is the change that is possible when we activate our higher chakras and we begin to allow our lower chakras to be influenced or governed by this higher inspiration. The good news, or the best news even, is that we can all begin to awaken the heart chakra and open the door to enlightenment by using the simple practices that we talked about, like the technique of dynamic prayer, which allows us to radiate this love energy into our world. And even a simple practice like that will begin to alter the flow of prana, or universal life force, through your subtle nervous system, begin to raise your consciousness, and will transform every aspect of your life. So this is really a call to action to break those bonds of materialism by awakening our higher chakras and reconnecting with our own higher self. Now, if you enjoyed that episode about awakening your chakras, then don't forget to hit that bell so you can follow us for more.
Now, you can also check out this video over here about that essential balance that we need to achieve in our life
in order to supercharge our spiritual evolution, or this video over here that goes deeper into a 3-part framework that you can use to unblock your chakras. Thanks for tuning into the show. See you next time.